Mark, we've had George here before, but we really haven't, this is, though you've been in the crowd, to know a little bit about you.
I was born and raised in Newfane, New York, Niagara County, North Niagara County, and I attended Hamilton College for a year, and then I went to University of Buffalo for the next 7 years, where I was on the 5-year program for undergraduate, and I also got my master's degree in urban planning from UB. And have actually moved here about 25 years ago to Fredonia, Dunkirk area. I was the director of economic development in the early 90s, right out of graduate school.
And so you're State University of Buffalo, you got your BS in environmental design, master's degree in urban planning, work your way into Chautauqua County. Why don't you talk a little bit about your wife? She's really the big name in the family.
I knew you'd go right there. My wife Katie is the director of the Workforce Investment Board. They run Chautauqua Works, and they provide training to folks that are looking for jobs, and also help to connect folks, businesses that are looking for people with the individuals that are qualified for that, and they also do workforce training for businesses as well.
So you got this, you were here in Chautauqua County, you worked in as senior planner, as deputy director of planning and economic development for Chautauqua County. Then you work your way, you go off to Rochester.
Yes, I did. For a year and a half I went to Rochester, and I was the Director of Economic Development for Monroe County. And I basically managed the Industrial Development Agency for Monroe County, and did a lot of deals, got in the mix there, but really learned a lot about how IDAs function. And Monroe County has consistently the top 3 producing IDAs in the state. So yeah, it was a good experience for me. I had an apartment there. I was doing the commute back and forth on the weekends, and then of course George and I got talking, and here I am.
And here you are. And what do you think attracted George to you as far as being a candidate for the dual jobs, County of Chautauqua Industrial Development Agency Executive Director and Deputy County Executive for Economic Development? What are your skill sets?
Well, certainly when I was running the planning department for the county, he saw that I think he saw that I get things done, and we worked together on a lot of projects, and forged a good relationship. And then also with my experience in Monroe County, managing the Industrial Development Agency there, saw that I had the right skill set in not only planning but also economic development. So I think I bring a unique skill set to this job. You know, it's less, it's not transactional. It's not, you know, it's more, hey, you know, how do we get to an end goal? How do we get to a resolution on these things by doing kind of implementing these planning methodologies?
So part of the methodologies, George, we will get to you.
I was going to say also he's tall, so you can get things off the top shelf. That was the big seller for me.
Yeah. I've come to learn that. Yes.
Whatever it takes.
Also, in that prior role before you became the positions you came into in Chautauqua, you were intimately involved in sort of a lead role in the Chautauqua Lake Watershed Management Plan, the macrophyte management strategy, formation of the alliance. I mean, so you come at tonight's presentation pretty honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly in the planning department we were involved in doing all that with the team, and really the macrophyte management strategy is I'm really proud. I'm proud of all those things, but I'm really proud of that because it really was a very unique approach to how we zone the lake, and we look at man's uses, and we look at environmental sensitivities, and then prescribing methods for how those areas should be managed based on those sensitivities. So that took over 3 years from start to finish to complete that, and it was you know, we had all the players at the table, so yeah, that was a good experience. Also, the watershed management plan, to be honest with you, I came in near the end of that, probably 2/3 of the way through, but was involved in that and getting that completed. And then the alliance, we worked with Harder Seacrest out of Rochester to form the alliance, and you know, and I think that the alliance certainly is effective, and it's going to become more effective as time goes on.
Just for the audience, and more importantly, probably for the camera, when we talk about the Chautauqua Lake macrophyte management strategy, and I'm not sure everybody even know the term macrophyte.
Macrophyte are rooted aquatic plants. So really it doesn't address algae. And that we knew that was a whole nother area and a whole nother lift. So really we renamed it, it was the SAV, Submerged Aquatic Vegetation, but that would have included algae. So we renamed it Macrophyte Management Strategy to really concentrate on the rooted aquatic plants.
So we had some newsworthy events here the last week, of which you were a part, and I mentioned the fact Dave McCoy in the cheap seats back there, as well as up here, with his wife, who just had her birthday last week, by the way. You'll see that out in case you're curious. That's the last piece of the YouTube pieces. But you, at some point, does George get a hold of you to say, hey, what do you think, Mark? Or how did kind of the introduction of the substance of a consensus strategy?
I believe it was maybe even a cabinet meeting where George says, I really want to do a consensus strategy for Chautauqua Lake, weed management in Chautauqua Lake. Do I have any volunteers? And I sort of went, and he's like, all right. You know, so really, I think that's how it came about, was really talking it through. And I think with my planning background, again, try to set up kind of a methodology for how do we get to the end. We got to start with this, and then we got to do this and this and this. So I really think that that's basically how it came about.
George, anything you want to talk about Mark before we leave?
Talk about Mark a little bit. You know, I think one of the key things with Mark is that he has a tremendous amount of passion, and you know, from the very beginning, I talked about being proactive, and having taking on a new look at how we are going to address our economic development strategy, and just you know, where we're going to guide the ship going forward. And you know, Mark was a perfect fit in my opinion, because this is about doing things differently, and it's about really forging a new path. And Mark's expertise and knowledge and energy and passion was a great fit for us. And then you add into his deep knowledge of what already is going on in Chautauqua County with his years of experience here. And it was certainly, for me, the perfect choice to head both the IDA and the Planning and Economic Development Division.
I'm going to lead into George a little bit. This is from Todd Tranum. Consensus and action will define future Chautauqua Lake. This is a January Post-Journal prepared statement. And he went on to say, the infighting among lake organizations reached a crescendo this past year. Editorials pointing fingers and making accusations coupled with a lawsuit have been a setback for progress toward improving the overall condition. To the credit of each organization, they are striving to enhance Chautauqua Lake, and for that they should be commended. In the midst of this animosity, it is important to recognize the various lake groups share the common goal and care deeply about the lake. And then he said, we support and applaud County Executive George Borrello in his effort to build consensus among the organizations that are working on the health of the lake. This was January 6th, 2019. Was there an aha moment for you, George, where you woke up one morning and said, you know, maybe I should take the power of my position as county executive and take a in a historically extraordinary role in the lake.
Well, the aha moment was, it wasn't a one day wake up an epiphany. What it was speaking individually to these groups and people, in these groups. I found that the reality was there was a lot more in common than we had that was, that people disagreed on. And it really came to my attention that as I spoke with each individual organization, that there was a nexus of opinions as to things that were good for the lake to move us forward. And it was that moment that I said, we have consensus. The problem is the noise is getting in the way. And the fact that there are, barriers to people working together. And quite frankly, there are people, that individuals, who have good intentions, but that they themselves are, myopic in their views of how the lake should be managed. So that's where it came to the point to say, we at the county, what do we have? We have the ability to bring people together. That's what we've done, as I've said before, communication and collaboration to move the county forward. So there was an opportunity for the county to take that lead role. And there was that desire, there was that vacuum. And many folks said, we'd like to see the county take a leadership role. And so we did take that leadership role. And that's what brought us to where we are now with this consensus strategy and the Memorandum of Agreement.
When you came up after kind of listening to so many of the groups, many of them have been here. In fact, this whole Turner Winter Series has been an idea of giving every one of these stakeholders an opportunity to sort of present their missions and visions and their goals. As you brought this back to cabinet and some of the legislative leaders saying the county executive in his role is going to take this, was there any conversation, any pushback, George, with any internal sort of within the executive branch or even the legislative branch?
Well, the first response was, "Are you crazy?" After we got over that, then it was, just going through the feedback that I received. So, and again, I think, all kidding aside, everybody was on board. The legislature, guys like Pierre, who've already taken such a deep and active interest in everything that has to do with our lakes and waterways, not just Chautauqua Lake, and just what's best for Chautauqua County. So, after speaking with several legislators and other folks, key members of not only the cabinet but other folks within our county infrastructure, including our watershed coordinator Dave McCoy, it became apparent that we had the tools in our hands to put together this agreement.
So in January, I'm again reading an article, this time by our Eric Zavinsky here, that he talked about county executive is optimistic that different organizations can reach general agreement and that weed management consensus strategy will be forged by the end of March. Why were you so confident?
Well, first of all, I think, after being in business for a long time, you have to set a goal and you have to set a deadline. And if you don't, things can drag on. And I was confident because, again, I had spoken with individuals within all the organizations, and I knew that there was a nexus of agreement. So it was just a matter of saying, in order for us to do something that's going to be able to kick in this year, before this summer season, we have to have this wrapped up in a certain period of time. And so we kind of reverse engineered and said, where do we need to be and when in order for us to achieve the goals we want to achieve this year? Because the knee-jerk reaction from some folks was, oh, this is just another study. You're going to do another study. And unfortunately, that was not helpful. But I understand where people are, where they want us to take action. So I understand the knee-jerk reaction as to opposition of something that they thought was another study. So that's why it was important to me to make sure that we had a swift timeline that we stuck to, and we did.
So when do you confer with a guy like Mark Geise and Dave McCoy, you have a cup of coffee and decide, how are we going to get to the end zone being something I can announce before March 31st? How does that happen? Do you want to take that, Mark? You want to?
It'd be more fun for you to take.
Yeah, well, I could, yeah. Well, you know, we talked as a team about, you know, what is the best approach? How do we get to the end? And we kind of sketched out a plan for who we, you know, how we needed to do this. And then we went and met with the DEC, and we talked through that plan and said, this is what we want to do, and we're thinking about this is how it would be done. And what we said was, you know, we really want to, first of all, we want to hire a consultant that is independent, that doesn't have a horse in the race, and have them go out and talk to the various groups and really pull out of them, what are your hot button issues? And then take those hot button issues and categorize them by topic, which eventually became the tenets, and then looking for, with these various opinions, if you will, looking for the consensus position in each one of those kind of themes, if you will, tenets. So, and then take those and then go back to the DEC and say, okay, what do you think? And which is what we did. And they were very happy and on board, and they had probably nearly a dozen of the top people at the DEC involved, and they felt really good about it. So then we developed that into an MOA, a Memorandum of Agreement with the legal department, and that's what you see today. And that's in a nutshell.
County Executive Borrello delivers the State of the County Address, February 27th, 2019. Here it is. And you called 2018 the year of communication, and then you called the 2019 will be the year of collaboration, especially for stakeholders involved in Chautauqua Lake water quality issues. And you said at that time the consensus strategy for the lake should be completed by the end of March. Further, went on to say each stakeholder is not going to get 100% of what they want, which is the nature of compromise, but this agreement and strategy will allow us to take meaningful steps forward without the threat of lawsuits or other actions that ultimately lead to further unproductive conflict. The consensus strategy will be important to the future health of Chautauqua Lake and the economic future of Chautauqua County. And that was really the underscore of your address back in February. So you go from that pronouncement, very, very visual and very public pronouncement, to that 30-day window to get it done. And yet, there's a process. There's a process in that because you didn't circulate it, I mean, among the potential stakeholders, you just did it. So, and you came up with 24 tenets. Why not 30? Why not 10? Why not the 10 Commandments? We know. How did that process work?
Well, you know, and I think one of the things we knew right from the beginning was that, you know, if we wanted to get this done in a timely manner, this was about kind of building from the ground up. And it was very important. First of all, I had these, you know, informal discussions with all the organizations and found out, you know, where their hot button issues were, their concerns. And then we had E&E come back through and do formal interviews. And then after those formal interviews, again, to get their primary concerns and then distill those down into the tenets. But before we got to the tenets, we took the summaries of each of the stakeholders' concerns and priorities and literally gave that back to them in writing and said, here's what we have as your concerns. So we took a lot of time to ensure that everybody's position was represented accurately. And that's how we got to the tenets. And why 24? Well, it just came down to, literally, it was a big spreadsheet, essentially, that had the organizations across the top and their concerns down the side. And then we literally broke them down to categories. Agree, somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, and so on and so forth. So we started with the, you know, with the things that everybody could agree on, and then went out from there. And as we went further down the list, we had to obviously adjust what we felt everybody could agree on, and to come up with a tenet that would be, you know, something that they could all agree on and come to a consensus. Now, I know people have said, well, now we have to go back and everybody has to, provide their edits. Well, unfortunately, and not unfortunately, that was not the process. The process was to get their concerns up front and to put this into a final agreement, and to have all these various stakeholders to go in and try to wordsmith each individual word in this document. That's a recipe for failure. So that's why we're standing firm on this is the document. We took a tremendous amount of due diligence and time to ensure that your words were carefully considered, and this is what it is. So we're standing strong on that because, unfortunately, I think where we have people that are concerned about the content now is, for whatever reason, those folks are now kind of maybe backpedaling a little bit on what they told us. So when we had one-on-one conversations, and this was more of a concept and not a reality, people were honest with us. Now I think maybe those that are pushing back against it are concerned that this is going to maybe actually become a reality for us, and they may not be able to live up to the things that they told us originally. That's my opinion.
Last Wednesday, so this is new news.
Yeah.
New era for the lake that you presented for all to hear, the Chautauqua Lake Weed Management Consensus Strategy, coupled with a memorandum of agreement that you signed, and the county legislature later endorsed and ratified.
Passed unanimously.
And it's titled the Chautauqua Lake Weed Management Consensus Strategy. Weed management. What's not in this memorandum of agreement with regards to whether it's Watershed, other areas which you just decided you're just going to kind of focus in on a certain area?
Well, first of all, I think one of the, I guess we'll say criticisms of the county in the past has been that we really haven't been directly involved in lake management. Our focus has been always working in the watershed. And as I've said many times in the past, the county's efforts have been on treating the disease and not just trying to manage its symptoms. What happens in the lake, quite frankly, is managing the symptoms. However, that being said, we focused on things that we know the short term, we need a combination of short term and long term solutions for the lake. And most of what's in this agreement are short term, and it's policy related, really. So, what's not in there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, down in the weeds details. Because those are the things that are going to be handled in due course by the individual efforts, whether it's the use of herbicides, whether it's harvesting, whether it's eventually perhaps dredging, whether it's how we're going to fund all these things in the future. Those will be the details that will be worked out in due course. This is about setting up a framework that is going to be something that we all can work within, that will free us from the threats of lawsuits and other things that are going to create ultimately inaction. Dr. Earlson's here tonight. He is one of the ones who I believe coined the term the Chautauqua Lake three-step, and we're certainly trying to avoid that from happening anymore. That's the purpose of this agreement, is to avoid this vicious cycle and to break the cycle by having everyone agree to these tenets.
So there are 24 tenets, and as you mentioned, designed to manage invasive aquatic plants, nuisance native vegetation, and hazardous algae blooms on the lake while being considerate of man's uses and the environment. We'll flip it back to Mark, because there are these 24 tenets, and with some degree of specificity, the bullet points, and I'm sure there's some underlying elaboration underneath it. But for example, the memo includes creation of a centralized lake authority to implement a comprehensive lake management strategy. Is that the Alliance?
It is not the Alliance. It is a separate group. Although the Alliance, the towns, the villages, and the county would be involved in really laying out what this entity would do. But that was something that all the groups asked for, is a central lake management. group, and that would put together a work plan every year on what's going to be, where are they going to do the work, and who's going to do it, and how much is it going to cost, and where are the resources going to come from. So it's more planned and not just, everyone's out there doing their own thing. So that's really what that particular tenant is about.
So, but it doesn't exist yet?
No.
Okay. And in addition, one of the tenets was the utilization of a science-based decisions with monitoring and sampling accomplished before, in accordance with the Chautauqua Lake Macrophyte Management Strategy. I know that one of the conversations that has been often written about is the various well-intentioned groups have their body of scientists, and they work in their area of science, and then inevitably there's a criticism of some form or fashion. And I also know that both, at least George, you were at Lake George.
Yes.
And maybe talk a little bit about that. Is that a model of what you're thinking about?
Absolutely. You look at Lake George, and I've said this is like looking at a crystal ball into the future. Because Lake George was where we were, maybe 10 years or so ago. And, what they did a couple significant things. First of all, they, got all these organizations to work together. And it wasn't easy, it was a bit painful. And they had to get rid of a lot of disruptive people within the organizations that were inflexible. And they had to, create new leadership in those organizations. The second thing they did is they had the same problem that we had, that everybody had their own science, so to speak, but there was really, it was science that already had the conclusions drawn before it was started. And then along came the Jefferson Project, which essentially said, here is a impartial third-party group of scientists that are going to gather data. And that data will be shared with all the organizations working on the various projects. But the data itself was much more comprehensive, and it was completely unbiased, and it was pure data. And let those folks who are working on various initiatives use that data consistently to draw the same conclusions and essentially be able to move their individual projects forward. So instead of having, reverse engineered science to get to the conclusion we already wanted, we have an unbiased group. And that's what the model we're trying to use here.
Talk a little bit more about that Jefferson Project. I'm just reading an article in January where you visited, I think in October, with a group from this area. And just what is it? And how did you find, it's organizational.
Sure, so it's a pretty amazing thing. First of all, it's an organization through RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, that supplied, with funding from IBM, that essentially created this entire, science lab right on the lake. We have, I believe, was it two buoys drawing data out of Chautauqua Lake right now. They have over 200 on the lake, and much more complex and involved. In fact, Courtney Whitgall Perry from Fredonia State came with us. She was absolutely drooling at what she saw as far as the amazing amount of, I think she was nerding out or geeking out or something on the science that they had there. And what they've done is they mapped out a three-dimensional model of the lake, and it touched on everything. Microcurrents and again, I'm not a scientist, so I can't go into a lot of detail, but they showed us this real-time model where you could literally, look at thousands of different data points, millions of data points, and use that data to determine, how different processes are being impacted. They then took that whole project and they took it on the road, so to speak, and took to Skaneateles Lake, and they actually solved a problem relatively quickly in less than a year at Skaneateles Lake, who were having horrible algal blooms. And they took the same model, they mapped out the lake, Skaneateles Lake, and they found that something that no one had ever discovered before, that there were these undercurrents that were disturbing the bottom. And there's a Pierce here, what was the term? It was undercurrent, microcurrent, I can't remember what it was, but there was a...
it was a wave through the ecoluminal.
What he said.
That was Pierre.
Yes,
Shine.
a wave through the hypolynium. And essentially that was disturbing the bottom and kicking up nutrients. So it was very different than what they had hypothesized once they got to the reality and had been able to truly analyze that. So it changed the methodology and changed the treatment to help solve the problem. And if you go to Lake George now, what you see is a clean lake that is very usable. And it is, and what it started with was a change in policy and a change in attitude. And it started with cooperation that led to collaboration. And that freed up the resources. Because right now, you know, there are a lot of resources that are sitting on the sidelines here that the people just don't want to jump in the mosh pit and participate. They don't want to be, you know, chastised, criticized, sued. So they're staying on the sidelines. So until we can show that we can all work together, we're not going to be able to tap into great resources like that from the outside.
Let's talk about that. Is just the actual process itself, and Mark, I'll get back to you now. George has signed this memorandum of agreement. This is not a memorandum of understanding, it's an MOA agreement. He signed it, and there is a sort of a time constraint that you're hoping other stakeholders will sign. And part and parcel of that, I don't say the carrot and stick type of thing, but is funding. Mm-hmm. Is funding. And gee, as long as I can recall, I can remember our congressman meeting with a variety of business leaders and federal funds available. I know you've been you've been successful in tapping federal money, but always the issue was money is there if there was consensus, because nobody wants to do what you just said, George. How do you see this playing out here under this particular model? The model of agreement, Mark, and you got 24 tenants, you got time, and for those that sign, will that document will now be used as a criteria for the funding sources, etc.? How does that work?
Well, first of all, I think, you know, this is going to take some time, right? So this is a 2-year agreement. The potential signers have till April 17th to sign. And we'll start really laying out what's next and laying out a timeline and you know, methodology for doing the things that this agreement says we need to do. In terms of the funding, I mean, certainly there's private money out there. There is certainly state and federal monies that are available. We're talking about a taxing district around the lake. There's money through the occupancy tax, and I'm sure other sources. But you know, if we're expending our time and our resources fighting each other on lawsuits and other things, then that's money and energy that isn't being put into doing something about the lake. So we feel very confident that, but if we can demonstrate that we're working together, just like the Jefferson Project, that there'll be funding that will be freed up out there to do these things.
Does the current, there's a process running through the Chautauqua Lake Alliance, they were our very first organization here, headed by Executive Director Aaron Prickley. And there's a process there which is sort of a grant-making process that they employ with the Chautauqua Science Team, among other things. Do you see that in this model, that execution of this agreement is a condition precedent to working through the alliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the alliance is going to play a key role here in a lot of the things that are outlined in this document. Certainly the money aspect, they've proven that they have the chops to get the money, and I think if we can, again, it's like any, you know, I've done a lot of grant writing in my life, and if you can show that you've got your act together and that you're working together and everyone's bought in, it's amazing how successful you can be. So certainly the alliance, I feel is and they're not the only one, but certainly the alliance will play a key role.
Has also the experience been the last year or so, there were even certain foundations, no need to name them, but have sort of used the alliance to assist in their I don't want to say grant making, but rather than selecting individual requests, they've yet let them look at this?
Yeah, you know, the motivation, or one of the motivations in the beginning of forming the alliance was that the foundations said there's a need for it. If you think about the foundation boards, they don't have the expertise to evaluate, well, is the money better spent with this organization doing this, or with that organization doing that, or that? Why don't we, you know, why don't we have some organization that has the skill set and the experience to be able to make those, you know, decisions on behalf of the foundation? So the foundations have committed to running their funding through the alliance, and the county has now too, and I think even state agencies are leaning towards that. So if they're not already committed, so yeah, that's one of the rationales for the alliance.
George, when you announced the memorandum of agreement, many people saw this as transformational, as a moment in time. Do you believe it? Do you believe that?
I believe it is, yes. You know, it's the first time we've had this type of, you know, agreement of any kind. You know, we were at a point where we just, you know, even though I think that the disagreements between organizations and groups were not, you know, a complete barricade, they unfortunately did stop people from working together. So, you know, again, these are tenets that we all agree to, and it will be evaluated every year. You know, just like the lake changes every year, this document is a living document. So it is a transformational, a game changer, because this is an opportunity for everyone to sign into this agreement and again show the unity that we're going to need, and that has not happened in the past.
So we have 24 common ground tenets for the agencies or municipalities to follow, and then you outline them in your memorandum of agreement, which, by the way, everybody can read them. They're on the Chautauqua County website. It's all there, the agreement itself, your presentation. At this point, as you're asking every one of the stakeholders to just sign it as presented, and it begs the question, is it negotiable?
No.
Okay. So if there is the fact that it's a living document, that in fact you're going to sign it now, and it's going to be reviewed, the goal, if there's anybody had a concern, would be as that document is being lived with as it is maybe it'll be reviewed 2 years from now or something?
Well, again, I think if you look at this as, unlike, you know, say you know, an agreement of service or a contract, you know, there are no, you know, it's not saying you must perform these duties. It's not saying that you have to have this particular change in the way you're doing things. All it's really saying is that we are all agreeing that these are the things that we have in common that we can agree to, and it outlines things that ultimately are going to be, you know, the boundaries, for lack of a better term. But still, everyone has to, you know, work on their own initiatives. You know, there are applications right now for herbicide permits that are in. You know, those are not impacted by this. But what will happen is if we stay within those boundaries of this agreement, it will free up resources to responsibly use herbicides in the, you know, and so it's, you know, people want to get down in the details, but this is, you know, this is an agreement that sets a framework, and there is still much work to be done within that framework, and there are no real handcuffs in there. But you know, I think, no offense to you, Greg, but one of the things is everyone wants to present this to their attorneys, and their attorneys are going to, you know,
I'll take it as an offense.
Yes. You know, this is a policy decision. Okay, this is a policy decision for every organization and every municipality to as elected leaders and as leaders of organizations that people have faith in. You make this decision to sign or not to sign on based on representing the best interests of your individual constituency. You know, handing it off to attorneys, you know, to nitpick every word is ultimately going to end in failure, and that's why this is a policy decision based on a living document that has built into it the ability for it to change in the future.
Talking about herbicides, one of the sections here is, the tenants is restricting herbicide use to 25% or less of the littoral zone in the South Basin, and herbicide applications would be limited to south of Long Point. Maybe Mark, if you want to take a swing at that, why? I mean, it's a fairly specific 25. Then you have a geographical location. How did the dynamics work for that?
Well, certainly one thing that we heard was, from a number of groups, is they would not support the widespread use of herbicides. So the challenge was to come up with a definition of what is widespread or what's not widespread, right? And so we looked at a number of other different areas. E&E did a lot of this research on figuring out who's doing what, and really came up with a 25% or less of the littoral zone. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's where the weeds grow. It's up to about 15 feet depth of the lake. So, which in the South Basin is about 566 acres, I think, is 25% of the littoral zone. And out of, I think it's 7,000 acres in the South Basin total, so it's about 10 to 15% of the total area of the lake. So that was really the idea, and then with a lot of consternation in the North Basin, and again, that was kind of another thing, really about using herbicides in the North Basin where the weed problem is exacerbated. To meet, E&E suggested again that it be south of Long Point. So that was kind of the process that we went through to get to that tenant.
Maybe this is a question for George. You issued this last Wednesday. It's been distributed. What's the feedback been?
Well, first of all, on last Wednesday when we did this press conference, quite a few people attended, and universally there was a positive response. I really didn't hear anything negative. Immediately following, got a lot of positive feedback. And then there's been some questions. People wanted clarifications on things. Met with some of the, with all of the municipal leaders from around, the town supervisors and mayors to answer some of their questions. So now it's, it's up to those folks to determine, whether they want to, to sign or not. But I would say overall, overwhelmingly positive. And there's this, obviously there's the people that are active and vocal, and then there's the average stakeholder, the person who just wants to have the lake that they can use, and that they the value of their property continues to appreciate, and that ultimately they can enjoy the lake with their friends and family for some time to come. I believe those folks, the vast majority of those folks, are supportive of this idea. That's the feedback I've heard. People just sending me an email or stopping me on the street and saying, hey, we love what you're doing. And that's really what we have to talk about. One of the challenges as an elected official is, you have to determine what do you believe, because we don't have polls on every decision we make. We don't have the opportunity to question and quiz every constituent. You have to say to yourself, what do you believe is, number one, in the best interest and serves the most people? And also, what do you believe that the people want? What do the majority of people want? And our views are often clouded by the fact that there are people that show up at our meetings, whether it's a county legislature meeting or a town board meeting or whatever, and they come and you may have a topic that we're voting on, and there might be 4 or 5 or 10 people that show up to say, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this. And you have to remember that that's 4 or 5 or 10 people in a county of 130,000 people. So you have to be judicious and decide, do those people represent the majority of the opinion of the folks out there, or are they just some very passionate people who are here to pound their fist on the desk and make their point? And I believe that the vast majority of people that are, stakeholders in Chautauqua Lake would like this and will support it.
Some of the vast support of the taxpayers of Chautauqua County live around Chautauqua Lake. And Mark, you might know the statistics as to kind of around
It's
394.
like 27% of the tax base is supported through people that live around the lake.
And not all of them actually reside or are residents here. They own property here. Two things. One is, how are you going to get the message out to them as to what you're doing? What's the PR aspect of this launch of the transformative moment in the lake to those folks? And second of all, I don't know who wants to speak, but talk about, there's lots of discussion recently about what would be the Chautauqua Lake. I think that's the governor. Hold
You
on.
want to take that, Greg?
Sorry. The Chautauqua Lake Protection and Rehabilitation Agency is sort of a taxing district. I know there's a couple questions. One is publicity. The other is dealing with a potential taxing district around that area, which would mainly impact, not completely, but mainly potentially impact those owners. What's the PR to that?
I'll kick that over to George. How about that?
All right. So I guess there's two questions here, right? This public relations. I think we've gotten the word out on social media and in our traditional media. We did the press release. This wasn't just, something like this could have been just sent in by mail or email to the various organizations, but we decided to do a press release so we could have an open and transparent rollout of this. So I believe that the public relations on the consensus strategy is out there and people are discussing it. So that's that topic. When you start talking about the district, creating a lake district, right now we have a group, an agency. It's a task force really, but the state requires us to call it an agency that is looking into this, just the same that we did when we created the Northern Chautauqua County Water District. We created an agency first, and they're gathering information. But ultimately, it's going to be a public process that's going to have to include not only a recommendation ultimately from this agency as to, number one, should we have a lake district, and number two, what could it look like, and what are the parameters going to be of that lake district. And then it's going to have to go through the public process and be vetted. And ultimately it'll be voted on by the county legislature as to whether or not there is to create a lake district. So that's the process. There's nobody trying to slide anything past the goalie here. It's going to be a very public, very open process. So now the question is, why? Why do we want to do this? I think if you look at the examples that we've seen from Juanita and Lamoka Lakes, Schuyler County, I think it crosses two counties if I'm not mistaken. They were in a similar, again, looking at a crystal ball in the future. They had a very similar situation to Chautauqua Lake. Their lake was dying and it was unusable. It was two lakes that were connected, so almost like the North Basin and the South Basin. Chautauqua Lake is in many ways two different lakes, but they're connected. So the same was with Juanita and Lamoka Lakes. Without going into all the details, once they created this lake district, they had a consistent source of funding. So they could plan for the future to address the issues in the water quality. And what they saw was their property values went up. They could use the lake consistently. And in fact, because they had a consistent source of funding, they had money in reserve to address issues. That's the future of this. Now, for those folks that say, look, I pay enough property taxes, and I don't want to pay another tax. And I get that, and ultimately it's up to the people to decide that. But some of you folks probably own homes somewhere else, in Florida, Arizona, maybe you own a condo somewhere. And if you do, chances are you pay an association fee. You pay a fee to maintain the common areas in your homes. A lot of people belong to a homeowners association. Some of those fees are really high, thousands of dollars a month for some people. Well, the purpose of that is to maintain the common properties, to ensure that it's usable and that your property is maintained and the value of your property continues to grow. That's what you pay an association fee for. This is essentially an association fee for those people that are directly on the lake or immediately, within the lake district, to fund those things that directly impact, the property value and the quality of life and the usability of a major asset that you own. So that's how I look at it. And in the case of Juanita and Lamoka Lakes, the highest annual fee paid by any one particular parcel of property, I believe, is $180 a year. And with that, they are able to do some amazing things there and not have to worry about year to year, what are the politics in Albany or Washington that are going to impact our ability to be able to capture grant money, and are we going to be able to do this year what we did last year? And it's an ability to free us from that and be able to do things consistently. And I think that's that's the best path for us.
Mark, you wear a couple of hats, one being also the head of the County of Chautauqua Industrial Development Agency, and I think everybody will agree that Chautauqua Lake is the jewel in the crown of Chautauqua County. How do you see this effort enhancing your ability to promote Chautauqua County?
Well, certainly we've seen success. As an example, the Harbor Hotel in Celeron, or the future development of Webb's. And when you talk to David Hart or Peter Krogh, they're a little frustrated, I would say, with the weeds around that hotel. And so we certainly know that it's an issue, and it's an issue that has to be dealt with, because people go there, and if they look out and it smells, or certainly that word gets out, don't go there. I mean, that's just one example of how that lake affects what we do. And certainly if we can make that lake more usable, the word is out there, it's a great place to go, then it's only going to improve our abilities to not only do hotels, but other types of development around the lake.
George, you said when you were here last time at the Turner Winter Series, and it was quoted by Mr. Zavinsky here, quote, "The lake is truly the centerpiece, the jewel of our county. What are you doing to actually make sure that the jewel sparkles?" was the question. That's why, for me, it was important for us to step forward. You want to elaborate a little bit on that, but that's a great verbiage.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's, when you're in business, you have to say to yourself, these are great ideas, but what's the process we're going to follow to achieve goals? So, the goal is to have a lake that is usable. Now, some people will say, hey, the lake is wonderful, we don't need to do anything. And there's others who are going to say, I'm going to sell my house because I can't deal with how horrible it is. And I'm a big believer that perception is reality. And with a marketing and business background, if the perception out there from the people that we want to use our lake, to own property on the lake, to come here and visit and patronize our businesses and have an impact on our economy, if we want all that to happen, the perception is the reality. And you can sit here and argue about what you think the lake is like right now and what's the status of the lake, but the perception out there is that the lake is in peril. So we have to change that perception. And that's why stepping forward to make sure that jewel sparkles is the process we are using to ensure that jewel sparkles for many years to come.
Pierre Shagnon, back there, at one of the early meetings, likewise, was quoted as saying, "This is an exciting time for Chautauqua Lake." That was a concluding remark when Pierre was here. Would you care to respond to that, Mark, from your perspective as wearing a couple of hats here in the county?
Well, I think with all the momentum we have with, what we've done with the Watershed Management Plan and the Alliance and the macrophyte management strategy and the consensus MOA, that we've got the right building blocks. We have the right things in place, I believe, in order for there to be a bright future. And somebody said it in one of our meetings, the dream team, right? I mean, I really think a lot of George and Pierre and Dave and all the other stakeholders that are involved in this effort, that now's the time. And I truly believe that. And so, you know, we're making it happen, and we just got to keep, you know, maintain our courage and charge ahead and just implement the things that we're planning right now.
According to the contract that I signed with George to get him here, he said, I need the final word. So, George, what is the final word?
I will say this. We spent a tremendous amount of time to ensure this consensus strategy, this memorandum of understanding, really truly brought into account all the overriding feelings and concerns and goals for all the stakeholders that we interviewed. So let's not get bogged down in the details. Don't let us get caught up in the weeds and drowned. I truly believe that this is something that every stakeholder can sign, and those that choose not to sign it are doing so for motivations and reasons that have nothing to do with what's in the best interest of Chautauqua Lake and Chautauqua County.
Thank you, Mark Geise, George Borrello. Thank you very much.